To draw has disbanded
Good evening. We begin tonight with breaking news. Tragedy has struck a prominent family as Mildred Horsehair, a well-known socialite, was found dead in her mansion earlier today.
Welcome to Conkers, a grand estate where a seemingly pleasant dinner party turns into a deadly affair. Meet Velvet, the butler at Conkers. Here's what he saw at the night of the murder.
The dinner guests started arriving at about 7:30 p.m. Reverend Truelove, the neighbour's old Mr. Archibald and his son, and Dame Christie, a lady novelist, joined the weekend guests. I served drinks in the parlour before dinner. From the start, I could see things weren't going too well. Miss Daphne looked as if she had been crying, and Mr. Jeffrey looked extremely angry. At dinner, I noticed young Mr. Archibald looking unhappy, Miss Topless furious, and Mr. Oscarson flirting with Mrs. Horsehair. Miss Daphne handed me a note to give to young Mr. Archibald. It read,
"Darling, meet me in the conservatory at 9:30. I have a plan. Desperately, Daphne."
I served port in the billiard room and discreetly passed the note to young Mr. Archibald. As I was crossing the hall, Miss Topless came out of the parlour and went to the ballroom. I caught a glimpse of Mr. Oscarson inside. At about 10 o'clock, I heard a piercing scream. I rushed into the hall and found Charlotte, the maid, standing there. She fainted after gasping. In the library, I found Mrs. Horsehair dead on the floor. The ashtray was full of cigarette stubs, the kind that Mr. Jeffrey smokes. The port decanter was smashed, and one of the silver candlesticks was missing. Miss Daphne and young Mr. Archibald came running in from the conservatory. Dame Christie, Myrtle Berry, and old Mr. Archibald followed. Mr. Oscarson and Miss Topless came from the billiard room, and lastly, Mr. Jeffrey arrived, shouting for help. He had found the vicar unconscious on the terrace. As I stood in the hall, observing the aftermath of the dreadful crime, it became clear to me that Mr. Jeffrey was the prime suspect. His volatile temper were no secret in the household. I couldn't help but recall the cigarette stubs in the library, identical to those Mr. Jeffrey smoked. His frequent outbursts and desperate demeanour seemed to suggest he had both motive and opportunity.
Meet Charlotte, the maid at Conkers. Here's what she heard on the night of the murder.
Around 7 o'clock, I went upstairs and heard angry voices from Mrs. Horsehair's room. Miss Daphne rushed out, sobbing, after her and threatened to cast her off without a penny if she married young Archibald. 15 minutes later, I heard Mr. Jeffrey on the phone, saying,
"Can't you wait a bit longer? The old woman's so damned mean with her money."
At dinner, I noticed tensions were high. Mr. Jeffrey looked like thunder. Young Mr. Archibald was terribly unhappy, and Miss Daphne looked like she was about to cry. Miss Topless seemed annoyed, possibly because she and Miss Daphne wore the same dress, or because Mr. Oscarson was flirting with Mrs. Horsehair. At 9:45, I overheard loud voices in the ballroom. Mrs. Horsehair emerged, looking embarrassed, and said she was looking for her book. In the parlour, Dame Christie, Myrtle Berry, and old Mr. Archibald were discussing murder. It made me feel quite cold. I heard a door slam and footsteps crossing the hall. Then the front door slammed shut. Suddenly, I heard a piercing scream from the library. I couldn't move or call for help. The butler found me, and I fainted after gasping. Daphne's financial dependency on Mrs. Horsehair gives her a strong motive. The argument provided a chance to act while emotions ran high. She created an alibi with the note to young Mr. Archibald, masking her involvement. As a family member, Daphne had easy access to Mrs. Horsehair and the house.
Reverend Truelove arrived at Conkers for Sunday tea, unaware of the turmoil to come.
Before leaving, Mrs. Horsehair confided in me about her plans to marry Mr. Oscarson, and Mrs. Horsehair altering her will in favor of her new husband might affect her son Geoffrey. I returned at 7:30 p.m., sensing a strained atmosphere among the guests. Dinner was tense, Daphne and Archibald seemed upset, and Geoffrey looked like a thundercloud. After dinner, we retired to the billiard room. Oscar and Archibald left at 9:30 for urgent matters. Geoffrey went to the library to write a letter. I went for a quiet stroll. Around 10 p.m., Geoffrey stormed out, ignoring my invitation to join. He was wearing a dark blue smoking jacket. Moments later, as I crossed the terrace, I saw a flash of something blue before I was struck from behind and everything went black. Oscarson's flirting with Mrs. Horsehair. Heard having a loud argument. Last seen near the library. Good at deception and acting.